Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Advance in Conversation. This is a series where we uplift the voices of Native leaders, organizers, and advocates who are working to strengthen our democracy across Indian country. My name is Megan Feeney. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Research and Data Manager at Advanced Native Political Leadership. I am based out of Washington, D.C., on the ancestral homelands of the Nacotchtank, Pamunkey, and Piscataway peoples. It's my immense honor to be joined tonight by Jacqueline De León, a senior staff attorney at the Native American Rights Fund. Before I properly introduce Jacqueline, I'd love to share a little bit about what we do at Advance. So Advance is the first and only national Native-led organization working to build an interconnected, research-informed approach to power building. So that means we take a holistic perspective. We've got leadership recruitment and support. We've got research and data. We've got national coordination. And one of the key ways that we are building Native political power is through our program, the Native Leadership Institute, or the NLI. And this is a leadership development program that is built by and for Indigenous people. The alumni from this program are doing amazing things. They are leading school boards, they are leading city councils and nonprofit organizations. They are organizing their community to take all kinds of action. So in this program, participants develop foundational leadership skills, they deepen their understanding of civic systems, and they build networks of support. And then on my end, we also run a research program in Advance aimed at strengthening Native political power. So what this means is we track Indigenous candidates and elected officials to understand the state of representation in government. We survey and we talk to Native voters to better understand priorities and attitudes. And we try to understand what policy issues have the deepest impact on Indian country. And that's all in service of supporting Native leaders to sustain their work over the long run and to break down barriers to representation. Okay, so enough about me. It's my immense pleasure to introduce Jacqueline De León, Senior Staff Attorney at NARF and a member of Isleta Pueblo. She leads NARF's voting rights practice, advancing litigation, policy, research, and advocacy to protect and expand civic participation in Native communities. She co-led field hearings across Indian country on Native voting rights, and she co-authored the landmark report, Obstacles at Every Turn. This is the report documenting barriers faced by Native voters. Thank you so much for being here, Jacqueline, especially during this what must be an incredibly hectic time for you. We're so grateful to have you.
Oh, goodness. Well, thank you so much. I'm such a fan of your work. It's such an important part of building Native power in Indian country. And I'm so happy to be here.
Amazing. So turning to what we're going to talk about tonight, the Supreme Court recently issued two major decisions that impact Native voting rights. These are Louisiana v. Callais and Turtle Mountain v. Howe. And tonight, we're going to try to understand what these decisions mean for Black, Brown, and Native voters and how we can fight back against Callais in particular. So we're going to go to Turtle Mountain via Callais. So let's just start at the very beginning. For those of us who aren't in the weeds with this all the time, what is the Voting Rights Act? Both of these decisions are about this law, the Voting Rights Act. You may have heard of it. What is this law? Why is it considered one of the most important achievements of the civil rights movement, something that America got right?
So America has always struggled, I think, a little bit with our identity. We have sort of two dueling tracks, if you will. One is this great promise of America, right? The promise of an inclusive democracy, that if you're an American, you can work hard, you can achieve the American dream, you can pass, your hard work onto your children and build a better future, no matter who you are, where you came from, the color of your skin, right? That's the promise of America. At the same time, however, we have a deep legacy of fear of that very promise, right? Where we have the people that are in power that do not want that type of power to go to often minorities, right? And in the civil rights movement, this was especially stark and true of our Black Americans, right? They really led the civil rights movement to push back against the injustices that they saw in their everyday lives. Jim Crow, the legacies of slavery, the continuing racism that's deeply embedded in America's history and in its present day reality. Native Americans ran a real parallel track to this civil rights fight. We have our own civil rights leaders. And I think that we have been fighting for a long time for inclusion as well. And we know that states and individuals and state legislatures and county commissions and school boards have often sought to keep Native people out. And we know that racism in border towns today is still very prevalent and has been for a long time. And so the Voting Rights Act was a culmination of the civil rights movement in 1964 that led to landmark legislation that made a couple of really important um, proclamations and remedies, right? So one is that, racism is an ill that needs to be addressed by our country. And that in the service of that, we have a powerful law that means that you cannot discriminate on the basis of race in voting, and that everybody's vote gets to count the same. And it gave us a bunch of mechanisms to make sure that that was true and that we could enforce it when state actors or anybody making the rules made it so that it was harder for minorities to vote. And what does harder to vote mean? It can mean lots of different things, right? So one thing we kind of learn about in school is literacy tests, for example, right? Where it seems as if all of the qualifications are the same. It's a neutral law that just requires that you be able to read, right, in order to vote. But we know that education was kept from many people, including Native people, and who were sort of only fluent in their own languages. And so such a test would mean that they would be unable to vote. The Voting Rights Act addressed that, gave us means by which we could sue for those discriminatory impacts. And it also gave us means that we could sue for those discriminatory impacts in redistricting. And redistricting is when you draw the lines. You can draw lines to keep people out, or you can draw lines that are fair, right? And we know that a lot of times, especially in Indian country, they may draw lines to crack, meaning cut Native communities in half, or pack, meaning put all of the Native communities in one district so they don't get as much voting power as they can. Or they can use at-large districts, meaning that they get a bunch of the majority party elects all the candidates instead of having space for a minority candidate. And we've seen that happen over and over again. And so the Voting Rights Act gave us tools, particularly in Section 2. Section 2 was the section that allowed us to fight back against discrimination. And unfortunately, we've seen a real decline in the Voting Rights Act.
Thank you so much for that, Jacqueline. You touched on this a little bit, going back to some of the history and like some of the civil rights heroes that you mentioned. Can you talk a little bit about like what was the human sacrifice that sort of went into making this law a reality? We saw decades of organizing, protest from folks, both Black and Native organizers, to make this happen. Can you tell us a little bit more about like the historical background that led to the law?
Yeah, so I think that, we are really used to sort of seeing the soldiers that marked, not the civil rights heroes, Selma, Montgomery, really just seminal moments where they have been marched and, the garden hoses or not the garden hoses, the fire hoses that were used against Black Americans protesting for their rights, led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights heroes that really were changing the discourse and conversation among Americans. But, we have our own civil rights heroes, whether that be, Elizabeth Paratovich in Alaska, really we have Miguel Trujillo, other Native civil rights heroes that pushed for a greater civil rights in Native communities and demanded the right to vote, many of whom were coming back from war and who just wanted to have an equal voice as the others that they fought alongside with for this country. And so, really, I think that we have to know that this is a long struggle that Natives have actively participated in.
Thank you so much. So zooming forward to today, we saw a major gutting of the Voting Rights Act in the Callais decision. Can you help us understand, sort of like on a very basic level, what the decision did and like
Yeah.
what's changed and what our new reality is?
So this has been really a culmination of the Supreme Court gunning for the Voting Rights Act for a long time. This is I think, third in cases that have been stripping away the protections of the Voting Rights Act. The first was in a case called Shelby County v. Holder, where the court got rid of preclearance protections. And preclearance was basically where if your state is especially racist and has a long history of racism, then before you make election rule changes, you have to pass it through the DOJ so they can look at it objectively to see if they would have impacts on minority voters. And in places like Alaska and Arizona, that preclearance was put in place in large part because of the overt discrimination that was done against Native people. And the court, did away with those provisions and demanded that Congress reauthorize them in a different way, which Congress has failed to do. And then in Brnovich v. DNC, the court again stripped the ability to bring vote denial claims. And that's where, in that case, it had to do with ballot collection and out of precinct voting. Ballot collection is incredibly important to Native communities that don't have residential mail delivery, that have, poor road conditions, that have to travel extraordinarily far to reach a ballot box. People that don't have resources often pool their resources together. Somebody will go around and pick up and drop off ballots. Out of precinct voting is really important to Native people, especially in Arizona, where sometimes they have the precincts that don't match traditional chapter houses. And so we know that those were tools to make it more difficult for Natives to vote, in particular in Arizona, where we know that there was a statewide election that was decided for Attorney General, that was decided by less than 300 votes. The margins that we're talking about are incredibly slim. This is in a state where millions of votes were cast, right? So we know that there's real power, right? That's being messed with on the margins, particularly against minorities and particularly against Natives that are vulnerable. And this third case, Calais, finally did in with Section 2, which is the heart of the Voting Rights Act. And so it made it incredibly difficult to bring cases against redistricting in particular. And it did so, I think, in a really cruel way. I will say cruel, because what it did was it just gave an excuse for anybody that wanted to, cut minority voters out. It said, if you just say that you're motivated by politics and not by race, then that's okay. And we'll allow you to do it. And when you do that, when you take a characteristic that the minorities, may or may share and share in, and then allow people to be categorized by that, and yet the effect is that wholesale communities are going to be cut out, right? What you've done is just rubber stamp racism. And that's what we're seeing, sort of immediately happen. We've seen, in Tennessee, they're cutting out Black representation. They're calling special sessions to really just target in on minority representation. And they're using it as a slander, saying, oh, these are racial gerrymanders. No, what these are not racial gerrymanders. What they are power being held by minority people, and allowing an actual voice in our democracy commiserate with the power that they're owed through their voting power. And owed as American citizens to just have a voice in this democracy. And so I think this decision is particularly devastating, and something that we should all be concerned about. It also made the legal tests for bringing a claim much harder in a variety of ways. But that's something that we'll continue to fight against.
Thank you so much for that. We're gonna get in a little bit to like what we can do because you like so passionately stated that sort of like gave the effects in a way that just motivated me personally to want to fight back against this. So hang tight. We'll talk about what we can do in a second. But for now, a little bit more on the case. So this case is about redistricting, gerrymandering, drawing lines and boundaries. And it can get a little like redistricting is a little nerdy.
Yeah.
It's a little complicated. It's hard to understand sometimes. Can you break it down for us? Like, what is the connection between redistricting, drawing the lines, and whether Native communities have their voices heard and their power?
So the people that are changing the rules, and I think frankly are cheating, do it because they know that we are entitled to power and that when we exercise power, it will demand more resources be allocated to our communities, right? So whether that's healthcare, education, whether that's keeping an AI data center off of our lands, whether that's, making sure that the environmental impacts of industry are shared by all Americans and not just centered on some communities, right? Whether that's the type of education that our children receive, whether that's, whether we're being taught about tribes and tribal sovereignty in our school. All of these things, right, have costs, and they are threatening at times to people that hold power and that don't want to share the resources, right? Um, and I think that what we're seeing in redistricting is something that's really easy. You could take a county commission, right? So you've got a county and say it's 60% white and it is 40% Native. This is actually pretty common in the cases that we see, right? And it's a county commission of 5 folks. And they say, you know what? We're just going to hold our elections at large, right? We're just going to have everybody gets elected to the council, and the majority that's elected, the 5 top vote getters get to have seats, right? When you do that, right? When you do that, then the 40% Native population that votes differently than the 60% white population isn't going to have a single seat at the table, right? So rather than having the 2 out of 3 seats that they would be owed, if you thought about sort of the ways in which power could be distributed, right? And that's not to say that every election has to be proportional to population, right? There are other factors that go in, whether or not, they're compact enough, whether or not you could realistically make a district, whether or not you could, all these kind of factors go in. But assuming that those things were true, whether or not those Native people would have a voice at all. And what we have seen was that it used to be the case that the Voting Rights Act was enough of a threat that we could go in and we could say, look, you're clearly violating the Voting Rights Act here, right? And now, and so they would settle with us, they'd create districts, and we get, Native representation on county commissions. And in certain places that we've gotten county commissions, the very next year, they're building roads, right? Building roads on the reservation, building roads between the border towns and the reservations, right? These are real, tangible impacts. And what we're seeing instead is folks are saying, well, now that the Voting Rights Act is not a threat, that we don't want to do that anymore. In fact, we want to go back to the at-large elections that we have. We just want to cut you out of any power at all. And that's really, I think, an ugly place for this country to be.
You spoke a bit there about the connection between like representation in office and real stuff that impacts people's daily lives, healthcare, roads. I'm wondering, is there a certain Native legislator or Native elected official that comes to mind that maybe wouldn't have been in office had it not been for the work of NARF and the VRA? Anyone you can think of, or just generally, like, can you speak to like what it means to have that person?
Well, we may talk about it later, but oh,
Oh, sorry, I think I maybe cut out for a second. Go
yeah,
ahead.
sorry, I think my connection might have been poor, but immediately came to mind was just our plaintiff and really, I think, inspiring woman, Colette Brown in Turtle Mountain, who was elected to state legislature in North Dakota, and who has faced discrimination in the chamber, who has stood up for her people, and who has, I think, really fought on behalf of her community in an incredibly inspiring way. And there are others across the country that have done, I think, the good and hard work of trying to integrate spaces that aren't always, that can be incredibly hostile, but nevertheless doing incredible work.
Thank you so much for that. We got to figure out the ways to get all of the other Colette Browns out there into office and sustain them in office for the long run. Okay, so moving to the content a little bit of the argument in Calais, we saw Justice Alito, in his opinion, suggest that, racial barriers in voting aren't a thing anymore. Racism across all areas of life isn't the problem it used to be in the 60s when the VRA was passed. And so we don't really need this law anymore. In your view, why does that not reflect the reality that many Native people still face?
Yeah. So I want to sit with that for a second because I think we all know that that's so wrong, right? I think just the premise, the false bill of goods that he wants to sell is that we are post-racial, that, you know, George Floyd didn't just happen, that South Dakota, the No Indians Allowed sign that was on the hotel just a few years ago didn't happen, that the sundown sirens that were ringing in Nevada didn't happen, right? These are modern injustices that our people and that minorities across the country face on a daily basis, right? And I think that that's especially true in Indian country, where we know that border towns, in particular, can be hotbeds of overt racism, violence, and I think truly shocking and disgusting displays um, of racism. And I think that the ways in which um, Justice Alito wants to recharacterize this country is a power grab, is a way of saying that we no longer need the protections of the Voting Rights Act because we've already achieved racial equality. But we know that that's not true. And we also know that every single time that Native people flex political power, the boot comes down on the neck of Native people, right? So whether that be in North Dakota, when folks elected at that time Senator Heidi Heitkamp, Natives were credited with her win. The very next legislative session, they passed a law that required addresses on IDs when they knew that there were homes on Native reservations that didn't have addresses on them. That is a modern day literacy test. That is racism. That is taking a vulnerability in a community and exploiting it. And we see that over and over again in just the case that the Supreme Court is considering this term, whether or not ballots can be counted if they're received after Election Day. That type of rule change would disproportionately impact Native communities where we know that mail service it takes incredibly long. We know that and it's poorer service, right? And that, in Alaska Native villages, 70% of the ballots arrive after Election Day because the plane to deliver those ballots in the wintry month of November can't take off, right? And ignoring those realities and, in fact, exploiting those realities is exactly the way in which they seize power. And so this recasting of reality, this reverse racism is worse than racism lie, allows the aggressor to be the victor, excuse me, the aggressor to be both the victor and claim to be victim. And that is untrue.
That's such a powerful articulation of our reality. I would like to take this opportunity to extend an invitation to folks who are listening. If y'all are like me, you might be thinking, like, what can I do? And I know that many folks who are listening may have witnessed or directly experienced a situation where you felt unwelcome or questioned or treated differently because you're Native, either when you're voting or just in your daily life, like where you live, at your job. I think if it makes sense for you personally, we invite y'all to share your story with NARF in advance. There's a link that you can click in the Facebook post or in the comments below this video to send us a note. And if it makes sense for you personally, sharing your story can be a way to fight back against this stuff. So it can help us inform advocacy. It can strengthen public understanding to sort of fight back against this false narrative. It can be a way to fight for fair representation. So again, like that link is in the comments in the post, and you can find more details on the form that's there. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. And just a sincere thank you to anybody who decides to share a story with us. Okay.
Yeah, and I just want to underscore why sharing your stories would be so impactful. So, at NARF, we've collected a fair number of stories of discrimination for sure. And we're trying really hard to get those stories out to the general public because we believe that if Americans saw the injustices that are placed daily on our communities, they would know that this lie that racism no longer exists is untrue. And I know that these stories can be incredibly personal and incredibly difficult to share. So I would just really appreciate anybody that is willing to come forward. And I think that, we can look at statistics, we can look at disproportionate impact and all the fancy words. But, it's hard for people to look somebody in the face and know what they're saying is a reality. And I think that's we're looking for folks to share. So whether that's, you walk into a grocery store or you walk into a bank and the clerk doesn't, makes fun of your ID or doesn't want to talk to you, or, we know that people have gone to cast their ballots and the clerks have fallen silent, wait for the native to leave, right? We know in South Dakota, they put up a chicken coop as a voting booth for Native Americans, which is insulting and disgusting. We know that, police are inflicting violence on our communities. We know that at hospitals, the maternal mortality rate is incredibly high, much higher for Native women. But attached to all of these statistics that we know are individual stories, and we're hoping that people will share.
Thank you so much for that, Jacqueline. Turning now to Turtle Mountain. Y'all have had a busy week. So 2 days ago, I think, 2 or 3 days ago, there was another major decision on Native voting rights from the Supreme Court, Turtle Mountain v. Howe. For those who didn't follow the case, can you give us a little primer? What was it about?
Yeah.
And what did the Supreme Court decide? And what does it mean?
Yeah. So Turtle Mountain v. Howe was a case that NARF has been fighting for a long time with our partner at Campaign Legal Center. And we have been fighting for representation in North Dakota and Native representation in North Dakota. And we were successfully able to increase Native representation through trial. So what did we prove at trial, right? We proved quite a few things at trial. We proved that the maps were unfair. We proved that we proved that really that Native representation is, important, so much so that the judge in that case reflected, really it just seems like, Natives are looking to have an opportunity to vote here. Kind of bewildered as to why it is that the obstruction was taking place. And yet we know exactly why that obstruction was taking place. So we were able to win at trial. And then the Eighth Circuit issued an incredibly ridiculous opinion. So rather than address the merits of our case on appeal, the state instead argued that no individual plaintiff, so whether that be tribes or individuals or organizations who are the people that have been bringing Voting Rights Act cases for 50 years, that no individual should be able to bring cases under the Voting Rights Act or under another statute in 1983. And in so finding that, the Eighth Circuit agreed and said, yeah, no private plaintiff should be able to bring Voting Rights Act cases under the Voting Rights Act itself or under Section 1983, shutting the door on every individual plaintiff. And this flies in the face of 50 years of precedent. It is so far afield of even a plain reading of either the statutes or really anything. It's, I think, a sort of beyond the pale reading. And the court, rather than address the merits of this claim, instead sent our case back down to the Eighth Circuit for reevaluation under the new standard that was issued in Callais. Basically, the court said, we acknowledge that we've changed the standard. And by change the standard, what that actually means is made it incredibly difficult. So does your case stand up now under this new standard? And we'll fight for it. We think that it does, of course, but we also acknowledge that the deck is stacked against us, and it's stacked against us on purpose.
I'm wishing you all the very best in your work on that, and I'm just so grateful that you are here with us talking about it 2 days after this happened.
Of course.
Okay. So it feels like a lot of setbacks. Callais was a setback, but no one's giving up. Personally, I feel just like renewed motivation to keep doing this work. It's kind of a privilege to be able to feel that way sometimes. So our fight is not over. Turning to like what we do, what the future holds. Where do we go from here? What can Native people do to protect their political power and fight back against this decision? And I'll invite you to take like one of two angles on this. One is like, what can ordinary folks do who don't work in this stuff? And then second angle might be, for those of us who are working on these issues like every single day, where do we redirect our focus and energy? Like what should our strategy be going forward?
So I think the first thing you can do, and this is going to sound trite, but it's true, it's vote and make a plan, right? And the reason is that so much, like you said, like there's a lot of setbacks, a lot of negative news. This is a lot of, that's intentional too, right? It's so that while we're explaining the problem, we're also doing the work of making it seem like you can never win, right? And if you feel like you can never win, then what's the point of participating, right? But we know that if our communities actually showed up, in full force, we could still change outcomes, right? And we know that it's unfair that you have to travel 20, 30, 40, 50 miles to get you to your polling place. We know that it's unfair that in places like South Dakota, now they're requiring proof of citizenship when they know full well that Native Americans born in this land are are the first Americans, right? We know that that is all wrong, right? And that the system is not extending an invitation to vote. But we know that if you do vote, that's the conundrum, right? That's the frustration. We could get so much change. We could inspire so much uh, a sea change in our communities. And so we still encourage everyone to vote. The second thing you can do is share, again, the stories of discrimination. Fight back against this idea that reverse racism is more harmful than racism, right? Fight back. It's so absurd to even say. Fight back against the idea that racism is over. Fight back against the bubble that people live in, where they're being told day in and day out that Native people, that Hispanic people, that Black people are getting handouts and hands up that they're otherwise not getting. Instead, talk about the realities of our communities, the realities on the ground, so that that pretense can be stripped away. I think those are all important steps. And then finally, I think just be in community. You know, get to know your neighbors and get to know and stand up and be strong. You know, the stronger that our communities are, the more resilient we are for this fight. And so I know that focusing locally is a good way to really get away from the noise and know what you can do day in and day out to improve your community.
If you're interested in getting involved in local office, check out the Native Leadership Institute. It's a fantastic program that will prepare you to do many different things, one of which could be running for school board or city council. Thank you so much, Jacqueline. Okay. On another hopeful note, one of my favorite things about my job is that I track Indigenous candidates, and it really feels like every single cycle, it gets easier and easier to find Indigenous candidates. So in partnership with ICT, we are tracking about 190 Native American, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian folks running for office this year across 29 states. In 2024, it was about 260 we found, so we're like well on our way to breaking that record again. It's really exciting to see the numbers increase year after year. Okay. Finally, I want to just turn to like a more personal question, Jacqueline. It must be hard doing this work. It feels like the issues just never change. Like, like you see the same thing decade after decade. It's just like kind of can feel like a hydra sometimes, and yet you still do this work and you inspire others to do this work. You inspire me to do this work. What keeps you hope? What gives you hope, and what like keeps you going today?
I'm not gonna lie, the last couple of weeks have been rough.
Okay.
I will say that I had a lot of moments where I questioned whether is the work I'm doing giving a false sense of hope in a system that's fundamentally broken, right? I wanted to really investigate whether or not what I'm doing um, is just a prop for a system that isn't going to tangibly change people's lives. And then the Secretary of State sent a letter to Wyoming tribes, the northern and well, yeah, and Northern Arapaho, I think. And they responded with such beauty and eloquence about why political power matters to them. The secretary basically said that their representation was a racial gerrymander and that they wanted to get rid of the gains that they had made in county office. And they said, you know, we're finally getting a foothold in local politics, and that we deserve, and that we're protecting tribal sovereignty and we're protecting our ways of life. And and it really gave me renewed sense of why we're doing this work, and gave me hope, and reminded me that small wins are just as important as big wins, and that we can all, I think, um, still have the fight in us, and that even if the system feels overwhelming, that we're worth fighting for. And so I got a renewed sense of hope, um, and my well got filled by the tribes.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I'll just add that, like, one of the things that gives me hope is working alongside y'all. And in moments like this, I couldn't imagine doing anything else. Okay, so switching over to some lightning round fun questions. Um, just for fun. If you had a walk-on song, like maybe you actually do have a walk-on song, I'm not sure. You go to so many events. What would it be?
Um, well, you know, I think Janelle Monáe has a song that I really like. Gosh, what's it called? It's like something about a change is gonna come. Um, and it's a really fun song. I'm a big Janelle Monáe fan, and so that would probably be um, my walk-on song. But I'm a really big fan, but also my brain can't hold on to names or anything like that. My brain's good at some things and really bad at others. So, which is why I hope I said the Northern Arapaho earlier.
Yeah,
Is
you did.
issued the statement? Yeah. I'm like, so yeah, that's my weakness, is actually remembering where I am. I'm usually lost, and the names of anything. So
That's a great answer. I chose a question that was gonna reveal how out of touch I am with the culture. So, um, amazing. What is your controversial food take, if you have one? I think pretzels and salsa go great together.
um, let's see, controversial. I love food. I like all delicious things. Let's see here. Um, do I do anything controversial though? Interesting. Um,
That's okay, or just favorite snack.
That's okay. That's okay. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if I do anything controversial with my food, but I do eat a lot of different kind of food. So, you know, I think that anything from a plain roasted chicken is delicious, or you know, shabu shabu. I like to make that too. So we'll see whatever's on my table. Maybe a good pozole or something.
That sounds amazing. Okay, that's it for me. I just want to say thank you again so much, Jacqueline, for all of your work, for being here tonight, and just a big thank you to everybody at NARF for standing in the gap and leading the way in so many different respects. If this conversation inspired you to learn more about how you can be the change in your community, we'd love to We'd love to hear from you. You can learn more about the Native Leadership Institute on our website, advancenativepl.org, and you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for more information. If you primary elections are happening in states around the country, so many different states. Early voting has started in a lot of places right now. You can go to voteamerica.org to make a plan to vote, check your registration, and just learn about when elections are happening near you. I think right now, you know, voting is more important than ever. It's not the full story, it's one piece of the puzzle, but it is like a very important piece. And that's it for me. Have a great night, y'all. Thank you again so much.
Thanks so much for having me. So appreciate it.
Thank you, Jacqueline.
Thanks.